David, the shepherd of Bethlehem, is one of the most fascinating characters in biblical history. His life is marked by contrasts, from forgotten youngest to acclaimed king, from hero who defeated giants to man who faced his own flaws and weaknesses. It is a journey of courage, faith, and redemption, which shows us how God chooses and shapes ordinary people to achieve extraordinary purposes. Between glorious victories and moments of deep repentance, David's trajectory reveals lessons that teach us to this day, inspiring us to face our challenges with faith and to always seek a heart focused on God. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a thanks a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. It was a day like any other in Bethlehem, a small village in the hills of Judah, surrounded by golden fields and breezes that carried the sweet scent of the land. Jesse, a simple and hard-working man, had a large family with 8 children. Each one seemed to follow his own path under his father's watchful eye. But there was something curious about the youngest of them, a boy named David. He wasn't as strong as his older brothers, nor as imposing, but he had a peculiar way about him that made him impossible to ignore. While the other sons helped Jesse with the crops or prepared for battle, David stayed in the field, taking care of the sheep. From afar, you could hear him singing. His voice echoed across the mountains, mixing with the bleating of the herd and the whisper of the wind. He composed songs about the stars, the valleys, and the God who always seemed to be near, even when everything was silent. The work of a pastor was not easy. On cold nights or scorching days, David faced challenges that shaped his courage. Once, while watching the herd, he heard a threatening roar. It was a lion, hungry and voracious, that was advancing to capture one of the sheep. But the boy didn't hesitate. Armed with his sling and his faith, he faced the ferocious animal and defeated it. For him, this was not extraordinary bravery, but a natural duty, to protect those in his care. His brothers, however, did not see greatness in tending sheep. They mocked the boy, as if the field was the only place he belonged. Little did they know that, as David roamed the hills of Bethlehem, a greater plan was already underway. In those days, the land of Israel was restless. King Saul, chosen by the people, no longer heard the voice of God. The throne he occupied was like an empty echo, and his heart, consumed by pride and fear, began to move away from the purpose for which he had been called. It was then that God spoke to Samuel the prophet. "Fill the horn with oil and go to Bethlehem. From among the children of Jesse I have chosen a king for myself." Samuel left with firm steps, but with a heavy heart. After all, how could a new king be anointed while Saul was still reigning? It was a mission surrounded by risk, but also mystery. When he arrived at Jesse's house, he was received with reverence. News of his arrival spread quickly through the village, and the family was in an uproar. Jesse gathered his sons, the oldest at the front, tall, strong, and with a strong presence. They looked like warriors shaped for battle, men who could carry the crown with authority. When Samuel looked at Eliab, the firstborn, he thought to himself, "Surely this is the Lord's chosen one." But in a whisper to the prophet's heart, God replied, "Do not consider his appearance or his height. Man sees what is before the eyes, but I see the heart." One by one, the sons of Jesse passed before Samuel, but none was chosen. Confused, the prophet asked, "Are these all your children?" Jesse hesitated, as if there was something insignificant to mention, and replied, "The youngest is still missing. He's taking care of the sheep." They sent for him. David came running from the fields, his skin tanned by the sun, and his eyes glowing like coals. He looked small, but there was something about him, an air of hidden greatness. Samuel didn't need anything else. He took the horn of oil and poured it on David's head. At that moment, something invisible and powerful took hold of the young pastor. The days passed, and David, even though he had already been anointed by Samuel, continued his routine in the fields as if nothing had changed. He still sang to his sheep, still faced wild animals, and still felt the presence of God in every corner of the hills. But the world around was not so peaceful. The Philistines, Israel's enemies, advanced in force, led by a warrior who looked more like a monster than a man. Goliath, the giant of Gath, was a frightening sight. His armor gleamed in the sun, his spear looked like a tree, and his voice echoed like thunder across the valleys. For 40 days he defied Israel, mocking God and his people. At that moment, David was not on the battlefield, but at home. His father, Jesse, asked him to take food to his brothers who were in Saul's army. Obediently, David left, carrying bread, cheese, and his youthful curiosity. When he arrived at the camp, the scene he found was bleak. The army of Israel, terrified, hid like leaves in the wind before Goliath's words. David was indignant. How dare that man insult the army of the living God? How come no one had the courage to face him? The young man's words soon reached King Saul's ears. When he brought him to his tent, he expected to see a strong and experienced man, but he found only a slight shepherd. But David spoke with a confidence that defied logic. "The Lord, who delivered me from the lion and the bear, will deliver me from this Philistine." Saul tried to dress him in his armor, but it was too heavy. David refused. He didn't need gleaming swords or imposing wards. His weapon would be the same as always: his sling, his stones, and his faith. David went down to the valley. Silence fell over both armies as the young man walked with light but purposeful steps. Facing Goliath, he looked like a leaf in front of a trunk, but there was something in David's gaze that disturbed even the giant himself. He spun his sling once, twice, 3 times, and then, like a spark that illuminates the darkness, he released his stone. The sound of the stone hitting Goliath's forehead was like thunder. The giant, who moments before mocked David and the entire army of Israel, fell with a crash that shook the earth. A heavy silence took over the valley, as if even the wind had stopped to watch. David ran to the Philistine's body, picked up his gigantic sword, and completed the act that would seal his victory. The crowd of Israelites burst into shouts of celebration, and the terrified Philistines fled with the leaves carried away by a storm. That day, David stopped being just a shepherd. His courage elevated him in the eyes of the people and made him a national hero. When he returned to the camp, carrying Goliath's head as a trophy, he was taken before Saul. The king, impressed, asked, "Whose son are you, young man?" David's answer was simple, but loaded with meaning. "I am the son of Jesse from Bethlehem." In that simplicity lived a strength that Saul would never understand. With the victory, David quickly gained fame. Songs about him echoed throughout Israel. Saul killed thousands, but David killed tens of thousands. But for the king, those verses were like thorns stuck in his skin. Pride and insecurity began to consume Saul, turning his initial admiration for David into envy. He saw in this young man a threat to his throne. David, on the other hand, did not seek glory. His presence in the palace was discreet, serving as a musician to calm Saul's torments. But even its gentle strains could not quench the fire of jealousy that burned in the king's heart. This is how the walls of the palace, which should have been a refuge, became a dangerous place for David, full of suspicious looks and hidden intentions. As time passed, Saul's hostility grew. The king, overcome by uncontrollable anger, tried to take David's life more than once. The king, who had previously welcomed him, now threw spears at him during nights of torment, trying to put an end to the young man who bothered him so much. For David, each day was a silent battle, not against giants or armies, but against the paranoia of a king who saw him as an enemy. In the midst of this chaos, an unlikely bond was born. Jonathan, Saul's son, became David's greatest friend. They were so different, Jonathan, the crown prince with all rights to the throne, and David, a shepherd who didn't even belong to the nobility. But the two shared a deep bond, a pure friendship that defied all logic. Jonathan saw something in David that not even Saul could see clearly. A heart shaped by God, destined for something greater. Their friendship was not just companionship, but also an alliance marked by promises. Jonathan knew that the throne of Israel was not for him, and he accepted this with rare humility. He made a pact with David, even giving him his royal cloak, a gesture full of meaning. "You will be king of Israel," said Jonathan, his words like a wind that whispered of what was to come. "And I will be second by your side." Meanwhile, Saul intensified his persecution. David had to flee, abandoning the comfort of the palace and fields of Bethlehem. He ran into the desert, where only the mountains and caves could hide him from the king's wrath. Still, even in the midst of persecution, David refused to lift his hand against Saul. He who had once been his protector was still God's anointed, and David respected that with a determination that few would understand. But in the silence of the caves, amid the cold nights and the distant noise of his pursuers' footsteps, David began to transform. Escapes and dangers shaped his leadership, and he was not alone. Little by little, others began to follow him, men as lost and desperate as he was. And there, in the desert, a new chapter began to be written. The desert was now David's home, a place vast and unforgiving, but also full of lessons. Every grain of sand seemed to whisper secrets of endurance, and every cave offered silent shelter from the dangers that pursued him. It wasn't just solitude that he found there, but also unexpected company. Men began to appear, coming from all over, attracted by something that not even they themselves could explain. They were in debt, rejected, dissatisfied with life and conditions in Israel under Saul's reign. Around David, this group of men transformed. They were not experienced warriors, but under their leadership, they found purpose. He taught them patiently, showing them how to fight and how to live with honor. David, the shepherd who tended sheep, now shepherded souls. There were many stories that spread across the desert, how he shared his bread with them, how he gave hope to those who seemed to have lost everything. In those difficult days, a brotherhood was born. Saul, however, did not rest. He pursued them tirelessly, increasingly obsessed with capturing David. Even so, David never gave in to hatred. One night he had the chance to kill the king. Hidden deep in a cave, he found Saul unprotected. His men encouraged him to attack, saying it was God's opportunity. But David, holding his dagger, only cut off a piece of the king's cloak, as proof that his intention was not to shed blood. He preferred to wait for God's time. Despite living as a fugitive, David began to build something bigger. His reputation grew, not just as a warrior, but as a leader and man of faith. Those who followed him not only fought alongside him, they believed in him, in his vision, and in the promise that seemed greater than any of them could understand. But the desert, with all its challenges, was just preparation. David didn't know it yet, but he was getting closer and closer to becoming a leader recognized by all of Israel. The surrounding mountains seemed to whisper, the moment was coming. Time passed, and the desert became more than a hiding place for David. There he not only survived, but grew. His leadership was consolidated, and the men who were once misfits now formed a loyal and fearless army. But Saul's fortunes continued to decline. His paranoia and hasty decisions led Israel into difficult times. Finally, in a battle against the Philistines, the king fell. Saul and his sons, including Jonathan, were killed. The news spread quickly, like a dark wind, reaching David in the desert. The loss of Jonathan was a heavy blow. David tore his clothes and wept bitterly. The friend who had once given him the royal cloak was now dead. But in the midst of the pain, a new responsibility fell upon him. The throne of Israel was empty, and all eyes turned to David. He did not claim the kingdom immediately. As always, David waited for God's time. It was in Hebron, a city in Judah, that he was first proclaimed king. There he began his reign, not over all of Israel, but only over the tribe of Judah. For 7.5 years, David ruled wisely, winning the trust of the people. During this time, the remaining tribes of Israel were under the command of Saul's son, Ishbosheth, but the kingdom was divided and weakened. David, however, was patient. He knew that unifying Israel would be a slow but necessary process. Over the years, his leadership and reputation grew. It was not just his strength as a warrior that made him stand out, but also his vision. He saw beyond the battles, beyond the territories. In his mind was an idea, a nation united under the living God. When the day finally came, when all the tribes of Israel recognized him as king, David made a decision that would change the future of his kingdom. He looked at Jerusalem, a strategically located city still occupied by the Jebusites. It was time to conquer it and transform it into something much bigger than a simple political center. The city would be the heart of the kingdom. But before he could make her his, he needed to face them. David stared at Jerusalem from afar, his eyes shining with determination. The city, perched high on a hill, was like a jewel protected by the Jebusites, who had long considered themselves unattainable. They mocked David, declaring that even the blind and lame could defend his walls against him. But David, with his cunning and courage, was not intimidated. That city would be his, not out of vanity, but because he knew it was the right place for the heart of a united kingdom. With skillful strategies and a loyal army, David led the attack. His men, determined and confident in their leader's call, found a secret path through the city's water source, a passage the Jebusites never expected. When the sun rose, David's banner flew over Jerusalem. It was a monumental victory, but also the beginning of something bigger. He didn't just conquer the city, he renamed it. From Jebus it became Jerusalem, the city of David. From then on, Jerusalem began to transform. David didn't just want a place to rule, he wanted a symbol. The city became the political, military, and spiritual center of Israel. From his walls, the king began planning not just wars, but alliances, victories, and a future that reflected the glory of God. But the conquest of Jerusalem was only the first step. David knew there was still work to do to strengthen the kingdom. Borders needed to be protected, enemies subdued, and the unity of the people reinforced. Military campaigns followed, and stories of their victories echoed throughout the region. Under his leadership, Israel became a power, and David, the shepherd of Bethlehem, was now known as one of the greatest kings of his day. David's kingdom flourished as never before. Jerusalem, the conquered city, was now the center of Israel, full of life, commerce, and celebrations. Under David's reign, the people felt safe, and the borders were protected. However, even in the midst of so much splendor, the king's heart, once so firm and full of purpose, began to waver. In a moment of weakness, he made a decision that would change his life forever. It was spring, the time when kings used to go to war, but David, instead of leading his army, remained in Jerusalem. One afternoon, as he walked along the terrace of his palace, his eyes were drawn to a sight he should have ignored. Below, on the neighboring rooftops, was Bathsheba, bathing. She was beautiful, and David, overcome by an overwhelming desire, sent for her. The approach to Bathsheba quickly turned into something more serious. She was married to Uriah, a loyal soldier who fought in David's army. When she sent the news that she was pregnant, David, in a panic, tried to cover up his mistake. He called Uriah back from battle, trying to make it seem like the son would be his. But Uriah, in his loyalty, refused to go home while his companions were on the battlefield. David then made an even darker decision. He ordered Uriah to be placed on the front line where the battle was fiercest, ensuring his death. News of his fall arrived, and David took Bathsheba as his wife. But what seemed like a buried secret did not go unnoticed in the eyes of God. The prophet Nathan came to David, telling him a parable about a rich man who stole a poor man's only sheep. David, indignant, condemned the man in the story, without realizing that Nathan was talking about him. "You are that man," declared the prophet, and his words were like a direct blow to the king's soul. David deeply repented, crying out to God for forgiveness, but the consequences of his sin could not be erased. The years passed, and the weight of David's choices marked both his life and his reign. His family, which once seemed a promise of continuity and strength, has become a field of conflict. David's children, divided between jealousies, betrayals, and tragedies, brought the king more pain than he could bear. Absalom, one of his most beloved sons, rebelled against him, leading a revolt that shook the kingdom. David, already old, was forced to flee Jerusalem, the same city he had conquered with so much effort. As he walked barefoot through the hills, listening to the people's cries, his heart was heavy, but he did not lose his faith. In that moment of humiliation, he handed his cause into God's hands, recognizing that the throne was not his, but the Lord's. Absalom's rebellion ended in tragedy, with the death of the prince himself, and David's lament echoed through the halls of the palace. "Absalom, my son, I wish I had died in your place." Still, David continued. He knew his mission was not yet complete. Even amidst the shadows, his vision remained clear, to build something that was bigger than himself. That is why, in his final years, he dedicated himself to preparing everything for the construction of the temple, a house for the name of God, a place of worship for all generations of Israel. Although he could not build it himself, he made the plans, gathered the materials, and instructed his son Solomon to complete the work. When his days came to an end, David rested, knowing he had fulfilled his part. His story was not just about achievements or defeats, but about a heart that sought God, even in the midst of mistakes and stumbles. David was buried in Jerusalem, the city he conquered and loved as the heart of his kingdom. The shepherd, the warrior, the poet, the king. His life was a mosaic of moments that together told a story as human as it was divine. David was not perfect. His mistakes, as great as his victories, showed that he was made of the same clay as every other man. But what set him apart was the way he turned to God, even in the darkest moments, seeking redemption with sincerity. Your life is like a song full of ups and downs, but always pointing to a higher note, faith. He teaches us that God does not choose the perfect, he chooses the willing. David, the least among his brothers, the forgotten shepherd, was chosen not for his strength, but for his heart. And even when he failed, when he gave in to pride, desire, or fear, his willingness to repent and seek forgiveness showed why he was called a man after God's own heart. We learn from him that courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of faith. He faced giants and armies, but also internal battles that required even greater strength. David reminds us that success is not measured by the absence of stumbles, but by what we do after we fall. And perhaps the biggest lesson of all is about legacy. David never saw the temple he dreamed of building, but he prepared the way for others to achieve it. He teaches us that our lives are part of something bigger, that what we plant today can flourish for generations to come. So David's story continues, not just in the pages of ancient books, but in the hearts that find in his failures and triumphs a reflection of their own journeys. He invites us to walk with courage, seek God in everything, and above all, never give up on being shaped by divine purpose. If you like David's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible